I buried my husband after 48 years together, believing there were no secrets left between us. By sunset, everyone had gone home, and I thought I was saying goodbye for the last time. Then our lawyer closed the church door and placed a small brass key beside a sealed envelope. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered he made me promise this would only reach your hands after your funeral, not after his. After yours. Inside was my husband's handwriting. Just one address, one key, and a single sentence that shattered everything I believed I knew. If you truly love me all these years, please finish the promise I could never tell you about. I thought I knew the man I married. I was about to discover the greatest secret my husband had ever kept from me. The hardest part wasn't watching them lower my husband's casket into the ground. It was hearing the silence afterward. For 48 years, Thomas had filled every quiet corner of our lives without ever trying. He hummed while fixing the porch railing. He whistled whenever he watered the tomatoes. He cleared his throat before speaking whenever he was choosing his words carefully. Everyone meant well. Everyone wanted to ease a pain no one could actually carry for me. Our son Michael wrapped his arms around me before leaving. "You don't have to stay alone tonight, Mom. I'll be all right, sweetheart. You don't have to be strong, I know." He kissed my forehead exactly the way his father always had. That almost undid me. One by one, the cars disappeared through the cemetery gates. The conversations faded. The footsteps vanished. Even the minister offered one last gentle nod before walking back toward the church. Soon there was only me, one folding chair, fresh earth, and a lifetime that suddenly belonged to memory instead of tomorrow. I wasn't ready to leave him, but I knew he would have gently laughed if he had seen me standing there. He always said cemeteries were for the living. The dead already know where they are. That was Thomas. Always finding a quiet way to make impossible moments easier. I brushed a few damp leaves from the bouquet resting atop his grave. "I'll figure this out somehow." The words escaped before I even realized I had spoken them. For the first time in 48 years, there was no one beside me to answer. As I turned toward the parking lot, I heard someone call my name, Mrs. Parker. I looked back. Standing near the church entrance was our family lawyer, Richard Collins. Richard had handled our wills years earlier. He wasn't really a close friend, but after decades in the same small town, he had become one of those familiar faces who quietly witnessed every important chapter of our lives. His black coat fluttered in the wind as he approached. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No." Richard did not meet my eyes. He turned the brim of his hat slowly in his hands like he wished someone else had been asked to carry this. "There's something Thomas asked me to do." I frowned. He was very specific. My heart tightened. Richard glanced toward the empty cemetery before lowering his voice. "If you don't mind, could we speak inside?" The fellowship hall had almost emptied. Half-folded tables stood against the walls. The scent of coffee and homemade casseroles still lingered in the air. Someone had forgotten a paper plate beside the kitchen door. Life had already begun cleaning up after death. Richard waited until the last volunteer stepped outside before reaching into his leather briefcase. He removed a small object wrapped carefully inside a white handkerchief. Then he placed it gently on the table between us. It was an old brass key, worn smooth from years of being carried. Beside it, he laid a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front was my name, written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. My fingers immediately began to tremble. When did he write this? Richard looked down before answering. "A long time ago. Why didn't he give it to me himself?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that. You know what's inside, I do. And you won't tell me." A sadness settled across his face. I gave him my word. I stared at the envelope. Thomas had never kept things from me. Not important things. Not in 48 years. Richard slowly pushed both the key and the envelope toward me. He left me very clear instructions. He told me to place these into your hands only after everything else was finished. I looked up. "The funeral." Richard nodded once. Those were his exact words. I swallowed against the ache in my throat. He said there would come a moment when everyone else had gone home. He believed you would finally be ready. Ready for what? Richard's voice softened almost to a whisper. "I truly don't know if anyone is ever ready for what is inside that envelope." He hesitated. I tried to convince him not to do this. His words hung in the air between us. The room suddenly felt colder than the cemetery outside. My fingertips rested against the seal, but I couldn't bring myself to break it. For the first time since I had met Thomas Parker all those decades ago, I realized my husband had carried something inside his heart that I had never seen. And somehow, He had waited until after his death to tell me. I didn't open the envelope at the church. For a long moment I simply held it in both hands as though it might still be warm from his touch. Richard stood quietly across the table. He had always been a patient man, the kind who understood that grief could slow even the smallest decision. "I should probably drive you home," he said softly. "I'll be fine," he hesitated. "If you have questions after you read it, you may call me. You know I will." He offered the faintest smile. "I hope you'll forgive me when I tell you there are some questions I cannot answer. You promised him I did, and you intend to keep that promise." I owe him that I looked down at the envelope once more. "So do I." Richard gave a small nod before walking toward the door. Just before he stepped outside, he turned back. "He loved you very much, Mrs. Parker, I know." "No." His voice caught for the first time that afternoon. "I don't think you know quite how much." Then he was gone. The church grew silent once again. I slipped the brass key into my coat pocket and carried the envelope to my car as though it were something fragile enough to shatter if I moved too quickly. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes. Every mile felt unfamiliar. I had traveled that same road beside Thomas hundreds of times. He always insisted on taking the scenic route along the river, even when it added 10 extra minutes. Time spent looking at beautiful things is never wasted. That was something he liked to say. Back then I used to roll my eyes and pretend to complain. Now I drove the same winding road because I couldn't bear the thought of taking any other. The house greeted me with the kind of silence only widows truly understand. No footsteps in the hallway. No television softly playing the evening news. No voice asking whether I remembered to buy milk. His favorite reading chair still faced the fireplace. His glasses rested on the small table beside it. An unfinished crossword puzzle lay exactly where he had left it a week earlier. I reached for the pencil before remembering there would never be another answer written in his careful block letters. I hung my coat by the front door. The brass key settled heavily in the pocket. For reasons I couldn't explain, I wasn't ready to look at it. Instead, I carried the envelope into the kitchen. I filled the old kettle with water simply because making tea had always been our answer to difficult conversations. When the kettle began to whistle, I poured 2 cups without thinking. My hands froze. 1 cup remained untouched on his side of the table. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly pouring it back into the sink. Grief has strange habits. It teaches your heart the truth much slower than it teaches your mind. Night had settled outside by the time I finally sat beneath the lamp in our living room. The envelope rested on my lap. My name stretched across the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Every curve of every letter belonged to the man I had loved since I was 19 years old. My thumb traced the wax seal. Then I broke it. Inside was only a single folded sheet of paper, nothing more. No legal documents, no photographs, no explanation, just 1 letter. I unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I have already said goodbye in the only way life allowed. I wish I could have spared you this final mystery, but some promises cannot be shared until the time comes to keep them. Before you think the worst, let me tell you something first. Everything important in my life began the day you smiled at me outside Dawson's Grocery all those years ago. You have been my greatest blessing every single day since. Never doubt that. What I ask of you now has nothing to do with loving you less. It has everything to do with loving someone else exactly as I once promised I would. Long before our children were born. Long before we built our little house on Willow Lane. I gave my word to someone who had no one left to trust. I believed I could one day tell you everything. The years passed. Life became wonderfully full. Then somehow the right moment never came. Not because I feared you, because I feared placing a burden on your heart that was never yours to carry. Now it is time. Take the brass key. Drive to the house at 317 Maple Street. Go alone. Please do not bring Michael or Emily. Do not call ahead. Simply knock. If someone answers, tell them only this: Thomas Parker kept his promise. They will understand. Listen before you judge. Stay until the story is finished. Only then will you know why I waited so long. When all of this is over, I hope you will still remember me as the man who loved you with everything he had, because that part has always been true. Forever yours, Thomas. I read the letter once, then again, then a third time. Each reading only raised more questions than the last. Someone who had no one left to trust. A promise made before our children. A house on Maple Street. Go alone. Thomas had never asked me to keep secrets from our family. Not once in 48 years. Why now? I carried the letter into the kitchen and unfolded an old road atlas from the drawer beneath the telephone. Maple Street wasn't in our town. It wasn't even in the neighboring county. After several minutes of searching, I finally found it. A tiny road outside the old mill community, nearly 3 hours away. I couldn't remember Thomas ever mentioning the place, yet he had written the address without hesitation, as though he had carried it in his memory for decades. I folded the map closed. The brass key rested on the table beside his letter. Small, old, ordinary. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. I looked toward the empty chair across from me. If you were here, my voice broke before I could finish. For years, I had trusted my husband without question. I realized that trust did not disappear simply because I no longer understood. He had asked me to listen before I judged. After 48 years together, he had earned that much. Before going to bed, I placed the letter back inside its envelope, set the brass key beside my car keys, and wrote the address onto a small notepad. At first light, I would begin the journey to a place I had never heard of, to meet someone I had never known, and to discover the promise my husband had carried in silence for almost half a century. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas's handwriting. Go alone, listen before you judge. Thomas Parker kept his promise. Those words circled through my thoughts until the first pale light slipped through our bedroom curtains. For 48 years, I had never questioned where Thomas went when work occasionally called him away for a day or two. He was an electrical engineer for the county during most of his career. Sometimes storms damaged substations in neighboring towns. Sometimes old bridges needed emergency inspections. Sometimes he simply said he had business a few counties over. I had always believed him, not because I was naive, because he had never given me a reason not to. Now every one of those memories returned wearing a different face. I rose before sunrise and moved quietly through the house. Old habits linger long after the reason for them disappears. I almost called upstairs to ask if Thomas wanted coffee. I almost reached for his favorite blue mug. Instead, I made 1 cup. Butter spread across toast that only one person would eat. The silence settled beside me at the kitchen table like an unwelcome guest. The envelope rested beside my plate. The brass key lay on top of it. Even in the soft morning light, it looked older than I remembered. Its edges were worn smooth, as though it had been carried in someone's pocket for many years. How many times had Thomas reached into his coat and felt this very key? How many times had he thought about the promise it represented? Questions had become my breakfast. When I finished eating, I slipped the key into my purse, folded his letter carefully, and started the drive toward Maple Street. The highway carried me farther from home than I had traveled alone in years. The familiar neighborhood slowly gave way to rolling farmland. Old red barns leaned gently with age. Fields of corn stretched toward distant tree lines. Small towns appeared and disappeared almost before I had time to read their welcome signs. Thomas had always loved drives like this. He believed every road carried someone's story. You never really know a place until you slow down enough to notice it. I found myself driving below the speed limit, almost without realizing it. Perhaps I was trying to see what he would have seen. The address led me off the highway onto a narrow 2-lane road, then another. The pavement became rough. Telephone poles stood farther apart. Mailboxes grew older. Many of them leaned at odd angles as though time itself had become too heavy. An hour later, my navigation announced that I had arrived. I looked up. At first, I thought there had to be some mistake. The house sat at the very end of Maple Street, where the pavement simply stopped and the woods quietly began. It was a white farmhouse once, or at least it had been many years ago. The paint had faded into shades of gray. The front porch sagged slightly beneath its own age. Wild ivy climbed one side of the chimney. Several shutters hung crooked against the windows. The yard had not been neglected. Not exactly. It simply looked cared for by someone who no longer possessed the strength they once had. A small vegetable garden rested beside the porch. Tomato vines climbed handmade stakes. Bright yellow marigolds bordered the walkway. Someone still loved this place, even if time had taken almost everything else. I turned off the engine. For several moments, I remained inside the car. Thomas had known this house. He had written the address from memory. He had carried its key, yet he had never once spoken its name. I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around the brass key. Felt strangely warm, as though it had been waiting for this day as patiently as the man who left it behind. The porch steps creaked beneath my feet. I noticed a faded wooden rocking chair gently moving in the breeze. No one sat in it, yet somehow it felt occupied by memory. I raised my hand, then hesitated. What exactly does a widow say to a complete stranger carrying her late husband's final promise? I almost turned back. Instead, I knocked. Nothing. I waited, knocked again. Still nothing. Just as I began to wonder whether the house had been abandoned, I heard slow footsteps somewhere inside, each one measured, careful, the sound of someone whose body had learned to negotiate every movement. Several locks clicked one after another. The door opened only a few inches. An elderly woman looked out. She appeared to be about my age, perhaps a year or two older. Silver hair pulled neatly into a loose braid. Soft blue eyes clouded slightly with age. She studied my face in complete silence. Not suspicious, not frightened, simply searching. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then something changed in her expression. Hope. Real hope. The kind that lives quietly for years without daring to expect anything. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "You came?" Her voice trembled. "I knew you would." I felt my stomach tighten. "I'm sorry, I think you may be expecting someone else." The light in her eyes faded, only a little, but enough for me to notice. She looked beyond me toward the empty driveway as though searching for another car, then back at my face. "You aren't Thomas." The words landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. Oh, I swallowed carefully. "My name is Eleanor Parker." For the first time, she truly looked at me. Not just my face. My wedding ring, my black dress, the grief I had carried all the way from home. Her hand slowly rose to cover her mouth. "Oh," it was barely more than a whisper. "Oh, dear God." The color left her face. She steadied herself against the doorframe. She closed her eyes for a moment. When 3 days ago she nodded slowly, not with surprise, but with sorrow that seemed older than this moment. Older than my husband's death. "I'm so sorry." The words sounded genuine, deeply genuine, as though she had lost someone too. I remembered the letter. My heart began to race. "There was something Thomas asked me to tell you." Her eyes lifted immediately. I repeated the sentence exactly as he had written it. Thomas Parker kept his promise. The woman didn't speak. She simply closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, then another. When she finally opened them again, there was no confusion left, only quiet understanding. So she whispered, "He really did." She reached for the edge of the door to steady herself. I always believed he would. Neither of us moved. The autumn wind rustled the old maple trees surrounding the house. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime sang softly. The woman took one long breath before speaking again. "I've been waiting for someone to knock on that door for 40 years. She looked directly into my eyes. "I just never imagined it would be you." She opened the door a little wider. "Please come inside, Eleanor. There are things your husband wanted you to know." I stepped across the threshold of a house that had quietly existed alongside my marriage for nearly half a century, and with that single step, I entered a part of Thomas's life I had never known existed. The house smelled of cedar wood, not the fresh scent of newly cut lumber, the gentle fragrance that settles into old walls after decades of quiet living. The kind of home where every scratch on the floor carried a memory. The woman led me into a small sitting room overlooking the backyard. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains that had yellowed with age. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner. Books lined homemade shelves. A faded quilt rested neatly across the back of a worn sofa. Nothing about the room was expensive. Everything about it felt loved. "Please sit." Her voice was calm now, still soft, still carrying the weight of our meeting. I lowered myself into an old rocking chair while she disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with 2 cups of tea balanced carefully on a wooden tray. "I wasn't sure if you still took it the same way." I looked up. "I'm sorry," she smiled faintly. "I meant Thomas." She placed 1 cup before me. "He always liked a little honey." The words settled heavily inside me, not because they suggested romance, but because they revealed familiarity. How many times had my husband sat in this very room? How many conversations had taken place while I believed he was somewhere else entirely? She lowered herself slowly into the chair across from me. For several moments she simply studied her hands. I suppose introductions should have happened before tears. She offered a tired smile. "My name is Margaret Bennett. I'm Eleanor, I know." She nodded gently. "Thomas spoke your name many times over the years that should have hurt. Strangely, it didn't. Not yet." There was something in her voice that carried respect instead of longing, as though my name belonged to someone she admired from a distance. "I wish we were meeting under kinder circumstances, so do I." Silence settled between us. Outside, a pair of sparrows landed beside the vegetable garden. Life continued without asking whether our hearts were ready. Margaret finally reached for a small framed photograph resting on the table beside her. She turned it toward me. The picture showed a group of young people standing outside what appeared to be an old brick building. The colors had faded almost completely. At first I struggled to recognize anyone, then my breath caught. There he was, Thomas, no older than 23. His hair darker, his shoulders straighter, his smile almost boyish. I had never seen this photograph before. He was handsome. Margaret laughed softly. He never believed that. My fingers rested against the edge of the frame. "When was this taken?" 1978. Only a year before Thomas and I met. He had just returned home from the army. I blinked. "The army?" Margaret looked surprised. "You didn't know?" I slowly shook my head. "He rarely talked about those years. He never liked speaking about them." She looked toward the window. "He said some memories should be carried quietly." I remembered all the evenings when Thomas changed the television channel whenever war documentaries appeared. The way fireworks on the 4th of July always made him drift indoors before the celebrations ended. The occasional nightmares that woke him just before dawn. When I asked about them, he always smiled and said, "Just old dreams." I had accepted that answer. Now I wondered how many old dreams had never truly left him. Margaret folded her hands together. "We met because of my younger brother, your brother Daniel." She smiled at the name. "He and Thomas served together." Another piece quietly fell into place. They became close. Closer than brothers. She paused. They looked after each other when things became difficult. I listened without interrupting. Thomas had always spoken warmly about friendship, yet he had almost never used specific names from those years, as though remembering them carried more pain than comfort. When they came home, Margaret continued, Daniel wasn't the same. She stared into her untouched tea. He smiled less. He hardly slept. He jumped whenever someone closed a door too loudly. Her fingers tightened around the cup. We didn't have the words for those things back then. We only knew he wasn't really home. A sadness settled over the room. I thought of all the conversations America has finally begun having about invisible wounds, about the burdens soldiers often carry long after the uniforms are packed away. Many families had suffered in silence because no one understood what those scars looked like. Thomas visited often, Margaret said quietly. He refused to let Daniel fight everything alone. I smiled despite myself. That sounds like him. She returned the smile. He believed promises mattered. The sentence lingered between us. I remembered the letter tucked safely inside my purse. Some promises cannot be shared until the time comes to keep them. What happened to Daniel? Margaret lowered her eyes. He died. The words were almost inaudible. Only 18 months after coming home. I'm so sorry. So was Thomas. She took a slow breath. I've never seen another man blame himself the way your husband did. My heart tightened. Why? Margaret looked directly at me. Because he believed he had failed the one person he promised never to leave behind. A chill moved through me. Thomas had carried guilt, deep guilt, for decades. Yet this still didn't explain the key, the house, or why he had asked me to come here. Margaret stood and walked toward an old oak cabinet near the fireplace. She opened one of its drawers and carefully removed a worn leather journal. Beside it, she placed an envelope whose edges had softened with age. Neither bore Thomas's name. She rested her hand gently on both items. After Daniel died, she said, your husband came here one last time. He made a promise before he walked out that door. Her eyes met mine. It changed the course of both our lives. She hesitated. I've waited 40 years to tell someone what happened next. She placed the old journal in front of me. But before you understand the promise, you first need to understand the child. My eyes drifted toward the staircase at the far end of the hallway. On the wall hung dozens of family photographs. Among them was one picture that stopped me cold. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, standing beside Thomas, both of them smiling at the camera. I had never seen the child before, and I had never seen that photograph. My husband's arm rested gently across the boy's shoulders. Not like a stranger, not even like a family friend, but with the quiet tenderness of someone making certain a frightened child knew he was safe. I looked back at Margaret, unable to find the words. She followed my gaze, then nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered, "that is the child your husband could never forget." For several long moments, I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. The little boy couldn't have been older than 6. His dark hair curled beneath a faded baseball cap. His smile wasn't wide, it was cautious. The smile of a child who had learned not to expect happiness to last very long. Thomas knelt beside him with one hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. There was nothing forced about the picture, no awkward distance, no polite pose, only quiet affection, the kind that grows from time spent together. I looked at Margaret. "When was this taken?" She walked over to the photograph and smiled sadly. "The summer of 1986, I did the math without thinking. Michael was 8 that summer. Emily had just turned 5. Our family had been taking vacations to Lake Michigan. Thomas had told me he was traveling more for work that year. I remembered waving goodbye from our driveway as he packed a small overnight bag into the trunk. He always kissed the children before leaving. Then he kissed me. I'll be back before you know it, and he always was. Never once had I questioned those trips. Not once." Margaret noticed the change in my expression. "I can see what you're thinking." "I don't know what to think anymore." She nodded with understanding. "That's why Thomas asked you to come here." She crossed the room and knelt before an old cedar chest tucked beneath the front window. Unlike the rest of the furniture, it was secured with a heavy brass lock. Without saying a word, she looked at my purse. The key. For a heartbeat, I simply stared at her. Then my hand slowly reached inside. The brass key felt strangely familiar now, almost as though it already knew where it belonged. I handed it to Margaret. She shook her head. "No, he wanted you to open it." Carefully, I knelt beside the chest. The lock was old but well cared for. When I slipped the key inside, it turned effortlessly, as though it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. The lid lifted with a soft groan. The scent of aged cedar drifted into the room. Inside, everything had been arranged with remarkable care. Nothing appeared tossed together, nothing forgotten. Every item had been placed deliberately, waiting. On top rested a bundle of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Beside them lay several military service records inside a worn manila folder. There were newspaper clippings, old receipts, a leather wallet so weathered that its edges had nearly disappeared. Near the bottom rested a small wooden box no larger than a jewelry case, and tucked carefully into one corner, a single cassette tape. Its handwritten label simply read, "For Eleanor." My fingers hesitated above it. "I don't even own a cassette player anymore." Margaret smiled softly. "I kept one." She pointed toward an old bookshelf where a small portable tape recorder rested beneath several family photographs. He asked me never to throw it away. I looked back into the chest. Each item seemed to carry its own story, its own piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized existed. I picked up the military folder first. Inside were discharge papers, commendations, transportation records, routine documents from a young soldier's service. One paper had Thomas's signature, another carried the name Daniel Bennett. The two names appeared together again and again, assigned to the same unit, transferred together, released from service within weeks of one another. They stayed close after coming home. Margaret said quietly, closer than most brothers. I carefully returned the papers to the chest. Beneath them rested several folded receipts. Most came from grocery stores, children's clothing shops, a neighborhood pharmacy. One receipt caught my attention. It was dated August 14, 1986. Purchased items included school shoes, a backpack, 3 notebooks, colored pencils, a lunchbox with cartoon characters. Nothing unusual, except the name printed beneath the signature line. Thomas Parker. My breath caught. The purchases weren't for our children. Michael already attended a different school. Emily had never owned that lunchbox. I slowly looked toward the photograph again. The little boy. Margaret quietly answered the question I hadn't spoken. Thomas bought everything before the school year started every year. A lump formed in my throat. For how long? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the chest and removed a small stack of envelopes. Everyone bore the same careful handwriting. Thomas's. None had ever been mailed, he wrote constantly. She whispered. Sometimes after visiting. Sometimes when he couldn't come, he never stopped wondering if he was doing enough. I unfolded one of the letters. The paper had yellowed with age. The ink remained remarkably clear. It wasn't addressed to Margaret, nor to the little boy. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It looked more like a journal entry. One paragraph caught my attention. A promise isn't something you remember only when it's convenient. A promise becomes part of who you are, even when no one else knows you're keeping it. I recognized those words immediately. That was Thomas. He believed character revealed itself in private moments. He often said, "The things no one applauds usually matter the most." I had always assumed he was talking about ordinary kindness. Perhaps he had been speaking from experience all along. Margaret gently lifted the small wooden box from the bottom of the chest. Unlike everything else, it remained unopened. Its lid was held shut by a narrow leather strap. "He never allowed me to open this." She placed it carefully in front of me. "He said only one person had the right eye swallowed." "Me," she nodded. "He said if you ever came. He trusted you to know when the time was right." Slowly, I loosened the strap. The hinges creaked softly. Inside rested only 3 things: a silver pocket watch, a faded hospital identification bracelet, and a folded sheet of paper bearing Thomas's handwriting. Nothing else, no explanation, just 3 ordinary objects that somehow carried extraordinary weight. My hands trembled as I unfolded the note. Across the top, Thomas had written only one sentence. "Everything you need to understand begins with the day Daniel asked me to make a promise." I looked up at Margaret. She had been watching quietly the entire time. There were tears in her eyes. Not fresh tears, old ones, the kind that had lived there for decades. "The tape," she whispered. "I think it's finally time." I turned toward the small cassette recorder on the bookshelf. My heart pounded so loudly that it seemed to fill the room. In a few moments, for the first time since I had buried my husband, I was going to hear his voice again. Margaret walked to the bookshelf with slow, careful steps. She lifted the old cassette recorder as though it were something sacred. "I've tested it every few years," she said with a faint smile. "I was always afraid the tape would stop working before this day came." She placed the recorder on the coffee table between us. Then she carefully turned the cassette over in her hands. The label had faded. Only 3 words remained clearly visible. "For Eleanor only." My fingers trembled as I pressed the button. For a moment there was nothing, only the soft hiss of old magnetic tape. Then, a familiar cough. My heart stopped. I would have known that sound anywhere. Thomas cleared his throat before every serious conversation. Even after 48 years, he had never lost that habit. Then I heard his voice, older than the photographs, gentler than I remembered. "My dear Eleanor," I closed my eyes. For one impossible moment, it felt as though he had come home. "If you are hearing this," he continued, "then I have finally run out of time. I've rehearsed this conversation in my mind for more years than I can count, and every single time I failed." His quiet laugh carried no joy. "Some truths don't become easier simply because we wait." I reached for the edge of the table to steady myself. "I need you to know something before anything else. I have never broken the vows I made to you, not once. You were the love of my life the day I married you, and you remained the love of my life every day afterward." Tears blurred my vision, not because I had doubted him, but because somewhere deep inside me, the question had begun to grow. He knew, even after all these years, he knew exactly what I might fear. "So, let me tell you about Daniel." The room became perfectly still. We were 21. We thought coming home would mean life could begin where we left it. We were wrong. His voice grew quieter. "Daniel carried home wounds no doctor could see. He smiled so his family wouldn't worry. He laughed when people expected him to. But every day he slipped a little farther away." Margaret lowered her eyes. She had heard these words before, perhaps many times. "One evening," Thomas continued, "he asked me to drive him out to Miller's Bridge. We sat there for nearly an hour, watching the river. He told me he was afraid not of dying, of leaving someone behind." I felt a chill move through me. "He had a little boy," Thomas said. "His name was Samuel." I looked toward the photograph on the wall, the cautious smile, the baseball cap, the little boy. Daniel knew he wasn't getting better. "He made me promise something that night." Thomas paused, long enough that I could hear him take a slow breath. He looked at me and said, "If I can't be the father he deserves, promise me he'll never grow up believing he was abandoned." Silence filled the room. The tape continued to spin. I gave him my word, Thomas whispered, and 3 weeks later he was gone. My hand covered my mouth. Not because of surprise, because I could suddenly feel the weight of that promise, a promise made between two young men who believed they still had their whole lives ahead of them. Thomas's voice returned. I intended to tell you everything I truly did, but then we were married. Michael was born, we bought our first home, Emily arrived. Life became beautifully busy. I kept waiting for the right time. But every year it became harder. Not because I feared your anger, because I feared asking you to carry sorrow that belonged to someone else. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. I finally understood why she had never interrupted the recording. She had lived beside this burden too. Thomas continued. I never tried to replace Daniel, no one could. I simply tried to keep one promise. I visited Samuel. I helped with school supplies. I paid for music lessons. I repaired bicycles. I attended baseball games when I could. Sometimes all I did was sit beside him while he finished his homework. He never called me Dad. I never asked him to. He already had one. I simply became the man who showed up. I thought back to every business trip, every overnight inspection, every emergency repair that had pulled Thomas away from home. Not one had been a lie entirely. Many of those trips had been work. But whenever he was nearby, he had quietly driven the extra miles to this little house at the end of Maple Street. Never for himself, always to keep a dying promise. His voice softened even more. There is one thing I regret. I should have trusted you sooner. I underestimated the size of your heart. I lowered my head. Fresh tears fell onto the letter resting in my lap. You spent 48 years giving our family more love than any of us deserved, Thomas said, and somehow I convinced myself I was protecting you. I see now that keeping this from you also kept you from sharing the kindness you would have offered so freely. He paused once more. If you are listening beside Margaret, please hug her for me. Without a word I stood, walked across the room, and wrapped my arms around the woman who had carried this secret with my husband for 4 decades. She held me tightly. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. Thomas's voice filled the room one final time. The promise was never the burden. The silence was, if you can forgive me, then perhaps both of us can finally set it down. The recording ended with the familiar click of the cassette reaching its end. No music, no farewell, only silence. The same silence that had followed his funeral. Yet it no longer felt empty. Now I understood what my husband had carried all those years. Not another family, not another love, not another life. Only the weight of a promise made to a dying friend. A promise he had kept faithfully for 40 years, even when no one knew. Even when the person he loved most believed he had simply been away on business. I looked at the photograph of little Samuel once more, then at the stack of school receipts. The letters. The worn military papers. Every strange absence. Every unexplained trip. Every quiet decision. For the first time since opening that envelope, the pieces no longer looked like secrets. They looked like evidence. Evidence of a man who believed that love was measured not by the promises people heard, but by the promises they never saw. The cassette remained inside the recorder long after it had stopped turning. Neither Margaret nor I spoke. The afternoon sunlight had shifted across the hardwood floor. Dust drifted lazily through the narrow beams of light. Outside, the old maple tree swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Everything felt strangely ordinary, as though the world had decided to keep moving while mine had quietly changed forever. I folded my hands together and stared at them. They were older hands now, the skin thinner, the veins more visible. Thomas used to take them in his every Sunday morning while we sat on the porch drinking coffee. He always smiled before saying, "We've earned these wrinkles." Back then I thought he meant the years. Now I wondered how many of those lines had been carved by a burden he never allowed anyone else to carry. "I was angry once," Margaret said softly. Her words broke the silence without disturbing it. I looked toward her, not because he made the promise, she continued, but because he insisted on carrying it alone. She smiled sadly. "I told him more than once that you deserved to know." "What did he say?" Her eyes drifted toward the window. "He always answered the same way." She took a slow breath. "Eleanor already carries enough people in her heart. She shouldn't have to carry my guilt too." The words settled deep inside me. Guilt. Not shame, not fear. Guilt. There was a difference. A man hiding shame protects himself. A man carrying guilt often believes he deserves the weight. I finally understood why Thomas had never seemed relieved after returning from those trips. He always came home grateful, tender, almost unusually attentive. He would linger a little longer while washing dishes beside me, sit beside the children until they fell asleep, hold my hand during evening walks without saying much at all. I had always thought he simply missed us. Perhaps he did. But perhaps those visits also reminded him how precious ordinary family life truly was. My mind wandered back through 48 years. Memories I hadn't visited in decades quietly returned. The Christmas when Thomas insisted on buying one extra bicycle. He had smiled when I questioned it. I found a family that could use it. I never asked which family. The year he spent an entire Saturday repairing a stranger's porch without accepting a single dollar. The evenings he volunteered at the community center tutoring children in mathematics. The scholarship fund he quietly donated to every spring. Whenever I thanked him for his kindness, he always answered the same way. I'm only returning what was given to me. I never understood those words until now. He had spent 4 decades trying to honor a promise made to a dying friend. Not because anyone expected him to, because once Thomas Parker gave his word, it became part of who he was. Margaret reached for a worn photo album, resting on the shelf beside her. I think there's something else you should see. She placed it gently in my lap. Inside were photographs spanning decades. Samuel's first day of school, birthday parties, Little League games, high school graduation, each chapter of a young life carefully preserved. Thomas appeared in only a handful of the pictures, always standing slightly behind everyone else, never in the center, never drawing attention to himself. Sometimes he wasn't looking at the camera at all. He was looking at Samuel, watching, making sure he was smiling, making sure he was all right. I noticed something else. In every photograph where Thomas appeared, Margaret stood nearby, never beside him, always with respectful distance. There was no hidden romance, no secret life. Only 2 people faithfully keeping the same promise from different sides of grief. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I owe him an apology. Margaret looked at me gently. For what? For the questions I asked inside my own heart. I lowered my eyes. I never spoke them aloud, but they were there when I saw that photograph. When I learned about the visits for just a little while, I wondered if I had spent 48 years sharing my husband. Fresh tears filled my eyes. I was wrong. Margaret reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. No, Eleanor, she said softly. You were never sharing him. You were the reason he had enough love to keep that promise. I looked at her in surprise. She smiled through tears. He told me many times, if Eleanor hadn't taught me what a real family feels like, I would never have known how to keep my promise to Daniel. I closed my eyes. For years, I had believed Thomas was the one who made our home strong. Maybe we had built it together in ways neither of us fully understood. Margaret stood and walked toward the hallway. She returned carrying a small envelope. Unlike the others, this one bore my name. When did he leave this? The last time he visited, about 6 months ago. He told me not to give it to you unless you listened to the entire story first. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside rested a single handwritten page. My dearest Eleanor, if you've reached this letter, then you know enough to understand why silence sometimes felt easier than explanation. Please don't mistake my silence for lack of trust. I trusted you more than anyone in this world. That is precisely why telling you became so difficult. I knew the moment you learned about Samuel, you would love him too. You would invite him into our family without hesitation. You would insist on helping. You would make his burdens your own. And after everything you had already given me, I couldn't bear asking for still more. That decision was mine, not yours. If I was wrong, I pray you'll forgive me. I read those final words again and again. If I was wrong, I pray you'll forgive me. I smiled through tears. Oh, Thomas, I whispered into the quiet room, you foolish, wonderful man. After 48 years of marriage, he still hadn't understood one thing. Love had never been something we measured. Not in our home, not in our marriage. Love was the one thing that always grew larger the more people it touched. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside my heart. For For the first time since his funeral, the ache inside me had changed. It was still grief, but it no longer carried confusion, only gratitude. I finally understood why my husband had kept his silence. He hadn't been protecting a secret. He had been trying to protect every person he loved from a burden he believed belonged to him alone. He was wrong about that. But he had been right about one thing. Love asks us to carry one another, even when the weight feels impossible. And tomorrow, I intended to prove to Thomas that his promise would not end with him. The following morning, I woke before sunrise in the little guest room Margaret had prepared for me. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, I had slept without dreaming. The grief was still there. I knew it always would be. 48 years of love does not disappear in a single night. But something inside me had changed. Yesterday I had arrived searching for a secret. This morning I understood I had actually been searching for my husband, and somehow I had found him, not in photographs, not in letters, not even in the sound of his voice on an old cassette. I'd found him in the life he quietly built for someone who needed him. The smell of fresh coffee drifted down the hallway. When I entered the kitchen, Margaret was already standing at the stove. "I hope you still like pancakes," she smiled. Thomas always said they made difficult mornings easier. I laughed through my tears. He wasn't wrong. For a while we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the tomatoes in her garden. How neither of us could remember the last time we slept past 6 o'clock. It felt strangely comforting. Grief has a way of making ordinary conversations feel like a gift. Eventually, Margaret folded her napkin and looked toward me. "There's someone who wants to meet you." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Samuel," she nodded. "He knows you're here." "What did you tell him the truth that Thomas passed away? And that his wife came to finish something Thomas could no longer finish?" I looked down at my coffee cup. I don't know what to say to him. Margaret reached across the table. "You don't have to say anything perfect. He loved Thomas, so did you, that's enough." About an hour later, we drove into town. Maple Street ended at the old farmhouse, but the little town itself rested only a few miles away. Margaret directed me toward a modest brick building beside the public library. There was a wooden sign near the entrance, Maple Community Youth Center. Children's laughter drifted through the open windows. I stopped walking. "What is this place?" Margaret smiled. "You'll see inside." The building buzzed with quiet energy. Teenagers sat around long tables working on homework. Volunteers moved from one student to another answering questions. A little girl proudly held up a watercolor painting for everyone to admire. An elderly man patiently taught two boys how to repair a broken bicycle. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't impressive, but it was alive. A tall man with silver beginning to show at his temples walked through the hallway carrying a stack of books. When he saw Margaret, he smiled. Then his eyes found me. The books slipped slightly in his hands. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I knew immediately. The cautious smile from the old photograph had grown older, but it was still there. This was Samuel. He walked toward us slowly, almost carefully, as though he feared the moment might disappear if he hurried. "You must be Eleanor." His voice trembled. "I am." He looked at me with eyes already filled with tears. "I've wanted to thank you for 40 years. I shook my head gently. "You don't owe me thanks." "Yes," he whispered. "I do." He placed the books on a nearby table, then reached into his jacket pocket. From inside, he removed a faded leather wallet. Carefully, he opened it. Tucked behind an old family photograph was a picture I had never seen. Thomas, holding Michael in one arm, Emily sitting on his shoulders. The four of us standing in front of our first house. It had been taken decades ago. "I carried this every day," Samuel said quietly. "He showed it to me when I was 12. I looked at the photograph, confused. He wanted you to have this." Samuel smiled through tears. He told me, "Whenever you think you've lost something important, remember what a real family looks like." My throat tightened. "He talked about you constantly," Samuel continued. "Not your names, your kindness. The way you laughed together, the way you never let anyone eat alone. The Christmas cookies you baked, the road trips, the little arguments about whose turn it was to wash dishes." I blinked in surprise. "How did he know all that?" Samuel smiled. "Because those were the stories he loved telling. He never spoke about what he had done for me. He spoke about the life he wished every child could have." Fresh tears slipped down my cheeks. All those years, I had unknowingly been part of the promise, not through my actions, but through the example of the home we had built together. Samuel reached into his briefcase. "I have something else." He handed me a folder. Inside were architectural drawings, scholarship applications, photographs of smiling children, plans for expanding the youth center. "Thomas helped start this place," Samuel said years ago, "when I became a teacher. I wanted to create somewhere children could always find someone willing to listen." He quietly paid the first year's rent. He bought the desks. He repaired the roof himself, but he made me promise something. "What was that?" Samuel laughed softly. "Never put his name on the building?" I smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." There was only one thing he wanted. Samuel pointed toward a simple wooden plaque hanging near the entrance. It didn't bear Thomas's name. It carried only a single sentence: "No child should ever wonder if someone will show up." My tears finally spilled freely. That wasn't simply a promise Thomas had made to Daniel. It had become the way he lived his life. Samuel looked toward the children filling the classrooms. "I've tried to keep his promise too." "You have," I said quietly. "You've done beautifully." He nodded. "There's one more thing." He led me outside to a young maple tree planted near the front steps. A small brass lantern hung from one of its lower branches. Weathered by years of rain and sunlight, Samuel gently touched it. "Every autumn," he said, "we light this lantern, not because someone died, but because one person's kindness can keep shining long after they're gone." He handed me a small box of matches. I've never lit it alone. My hands trembled as I struck a match. The tiny flame flickered in the afternoon breeze before settling inside the lantern. Its warm glow spread softly through the glass, not bright enough to change the whole world, just bright enough to push back a little darkness. I thought about the frightened young soldier standing beside a dying friend, the promise spoken beside a quiet river, the 40 years of faithful visits, the hidden school supplies, the repaired bicycles, the baseball games, the letters, the silence. Then I thought about Thomas, not the man lying beneath a polished headstone, the man whose quiet goodness still lived inside every child laughing behind those community center walls. I looked up toward the autumn sky. "I finished it," I whispered. "No," Samuel said gently. "You continued it for the first time since I buried my husband." I understood something that grief had hidden from me. Love does not end when a heartbeat stops, if it has been freely given. It keeps moving from one life to another, one promise to the next, one heart to another. And in that quiet little town at the end of Maple Street, I realized Thomas's last promise had never really belonged to him. It belonged to everyone whose life had been changed because one man refused to let his word die with a friend. It has been almost a year since I buried Thomas. People tell me that time heals. I don't believe that's entirely true. Time doesn't erase love. It simply teaches us how to carry it differently. When I unlock my front door each evening, the house is still quiet. His reading chair still sits beside the fireplace. His old fishing hat still hangs from the hook in the hallway. His favorite coffee mug still waits in the cabinet above the stove. Some mornings I still catch myself reaching for 2 cups before remembering. Old habits don't disappear. They slowly become memories. And memories, if we're fortunate, become companions instead of burdens. The world has a way of teaching you that love is loud, grand gestures, expensive gifts, anniversaries everyone remembers. But the truest kind of love lives in the smallest sounds. And when those sounds disappear, the silence can feel heavy enough to break your heart. The first few months after my visit to Maple Street, I found myself looking backward more than forward, not because I wanted to live in the past, but because every memory had quietly changed. I remembered the Saturday mornings when Thomas insisted on stopping at the hardware store before we drove to Michael's baseball games. I used to tease him about wandering every aisle. Now I know he was buying nails and paint for a farmhouse at the end of Maple Street. I remembered the years when our children wondered why their father always kept an extra blanket and toolbox in the trunk of his car. He would smile and simply say, "You never know when someone might need a hand." He wasn't talking about broken engines. He was talking about broken hearts. I remembered the evenings when he sat on our back porch long after the sun had disappeared. Sometimes he spoke very little, sometimes not at all. I once asked him what he was thinking. He smiled and answered, "I'm counting blessings." Back then, I thought he meant the blessings inside our own home. Now I realize he was probably thanking God for allowing him to keep a promise for one more day. The greatest surprise wasn't discovering the secret. It was realizing how visible it had been all along, not the details. those remained hidden. But the kind of man Thomas had become because of that promise, his patience, his generosity, his quiet compassion for people carrying invisible burdens, none of those qualities appeared by accident. They had been shaped over decades by a promise he refused to abandon. Sometimes we spend our lives searching for extraordinary love. We imagine it arrives in dramatic speeches, expensive gifts, or grand sacrifices witnessed by crowds. Thomas taught me something different. The deepest love often leaves the smallest footprints. It is found in school shoes bought without recognition, in bicycles repaired without applause, in afternoons spent helping a lonely child with homework, in showing up again and again, long after everyone else believes the story has ended. Michael and Emily know everything now. When I finally told them, neither spoke for a long time. Our son stared at his father's old photograph resting on the mantel. Then he quietly said, "That sounds exactly like Dad." Emily cried harder than I had ever seen her cry, not because she felt betrayed, because she wished she had thanked him for being that kind of man while he was still here to hear it. A few weeks later, we drove together to Maple Street. Samuel welcomed them as though they had always belonged there. In a way, perhaps they had. Watching my children laugh with the man whose childhood their father had quietly protected, I understood something beautiful. Thomas had never divided his love. Love doesn't work that way. The more he gave, the more he seemed to have. The promise he made to Daniel never took anything away from us. If anything, it made him an even better husband, an even gentler father, an even kinder grandfather, because every time he chose compassion for someone else's child, he returned home remembering just how precious his own family truly was. The youth center has become part of my life now. Once each month I make the drive to Maple Street. Sometimes I help children with their reading. Sometimes I bake cookies for the volunteers. Sometimes I simply sit beneath the young maple tree while the afternoon sun filters through its branches. The little brass lantern still hangs there. Every autumn, Samuel and I light it together. Now a few of the children join us. They don't all know Thomas's story. They don't need to. They simply know the lantern reminds them that kindness has a way of traveling farther than we ever imagine. Last week, a little girl no older than 8 asked me why the lantern was so important. I thought for a moment before answering. Because someone once made a promise, she tilted her head. Did they keep it? I smiled. Every single day. She looked at the flame dancing softly behind the glass. I hope I grow up like that. So do I whispered. So do I when I visit Thomas's grave now. I no longer bring questions, I bring stories. I tell him about the children learning to read, about Samuel finally laughing without carrying so much sorrow in his eyes, about Margaret's tomatoes growing better than ever, about Michael fixing bicycles at the youth center, about Emily organizing the little library inside the building. And sometimes, when the wind moves gently through the cemetery, I can almost hear him clearing his throat before speaking. The way he always did. It makes me smile, 'cause now I know what I could never understand before. The greatest love of my husband's life was never a choice between me and someone else. His greatest love was becoming the kind of man who never walked away from those who needed him. And somehow, I was blessed enough to spend 48 years beside that man. There is one sentence from his final letter that I read often, not because I still need forgiveness, but because it reminds me how humble he remained until the very end. If I was wrong, I pray you'll forgive me. Every time I reach those words, I answer them out loud. Oh, Thomas, you were wrong about only one thing. You thought my heart was too small to carry your promise. It never was. Before I leave the cemetery, I always place my hand against the cool stone bearing his name. Then I tell him the same thing. I'll keep showing up because that is what he taught me, not with speeches, not with instructions, but with the quiet example of a life faithfully lived. And perhaps that is the lesson I hope every heart carries away from our story. Love isn't always measured by the promises someone makes to you. Sometimes it is measured by the promises they keep for others, even when no one ever knows the cost. If someone you love has ever carried a burden you didn't fully understand, I hope you'll remember this. The people who love us most are not always the ones who tell us every battle they fight. Sometimes, they are the ones who quietly choose kindness, day after day, year after year, never asking to be noticed, never expecting applause, only hoping that when their time is over, the lives they touched will continue shining a little brighter. Thomas's promise ended with words spoken beside a river many years ago. But its light did not end there. Like the little lantern hanging beneath the maple tree, it keeps burning. One act of grace, one faithful heart, one quiet promise at a time. As I grow older, I've come to believe that every marriage holds a few rooms we never fully enter, not because love is incomplete, but because every human heart carries memories, responsibilities, and promises that existed long before we arrived. The measure of a marriage isn't knowing every secret. It's knowing the character of the person who keeps them. For 48 years, I believed I understood every chapter of my husband's life. In the end, I discovered one chapter he had carried alone, not because he loved me less, but because he believed love meant protecting everyone else from a burden he thought was his to bear. If I could speak to him one last time, I wouldn't ask why he kept the promise hidden. I would simply thank him for showing me that kindness doesn't need an audience, that integrity isn't something we perform, it's something we practice when no one is watching, and that the quietest acts of love often echo the longest. Whenever I visit the little lantern beneath the maple tree, I think about all the promises being kept in silence every single day. A neighbor checking on someone who lives alone, a grandfather helping raise a child who isn't his by blood, a friend who never forgets the family of someone they lost. Most of those stories will never make headlines, but they make the world gentler than it would have been without them. If our story has reminded you of someone whose goodness was easy to overlook while they were here, tell someone about them. Carry their kindness forward, because that is how love continues long after the people we cherish are gone. Love isn't always measured by the promises someone makes to you. Sometimes it's measured by the promises they keep for others, even when no one ever knows the cost. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy any of us can leave behind. Not wealth, not recognition, but a life that quietly teaches someone else to keep showing up, to keep choosing kindness, and to keep every promise that truly matters. Thank you for spending this evening with me at Lantern House. If this story touched you, stay a while. There are many more by the fire.